palace, a single misplaced file had awakened a storm. And 3 minutes later, the world would begin to sense it. How Archie's records became palace property. The alarm that swept through the winter briefing room did not stem solely from the appearance of Archie's name in an internal document.
It arose from something far more troubling. Something that forced senior aides to confront a truth the palace had tried to bury.
Archie's educational records should never have been anywhere near Buckingham Palace.
Not in 2024.
Not after the Sussex departure, not after the layers of legal separation that accompanied Harry and Meghan's decision to build a life far beyond Windsor's reach.
And yet there they were.
To understand how this occurred, the palace had to retrace its steps into the foggy, chaotic months of early 2020, when the was being reached in real time. The exit negotiations, referred to internally as the Sandringham transition, unfolded with a speed and complexity unseen since the abdication crisis of 1936. Meetings overlapped with emergency briefings. Departments scrambled to draft new protocols overnight. Some divisions updated their systems, others froze them entirely. And amid that frenzy, certain files, specific notes, and particular transitional documents slipped through the gaps.
Archie's file was one of them.
In the earliest days following his birth, royal protocol dictated that any child within the line of succession, however distant in practical terms, held a placeholder dossier within the sovereign's household office. It was a remnant of older rules, established in the 1980s when digitization first transformed royal record-keeping.
These dossiers were not personal files.
They were structural templates designed to anticipate future educational, ceremonial, and logistical considerations should a child remain within the royal framework. Most consisted of brief notes, formalities, nothing more. But when Harry and Meghan stepped back in 2020, their departure triggered a chain reaction the palace was ill-equipped to manage. Internal systems had to decide which records to archive, which to delete, and which to transfer under privacy safeguards.
In theory, this should have been simple.
In practice, it was clouded by politics, emotion, and an institution grappling with a kind of departure it had never encountered before. As departments attempted to close the Sussex portfolios, an administrative assistant, overworked and overwhelmed, navigating a digital archive designed decades earlier, incorrectly tagged the placeholder dossier. Instead of being flagged for deletion or transfer, it was filed into a transitional queue reserved for unresolved updates. The mistake was minor, invisible, and quickly forgotten.
But digital systems do not forget. They wait.
And 4 years later, when the Sovereign's Household Office initiated its routine winter re-indexing of archived files, the forgotten folder resurfaced. Worse still, due to a misapplied filter, its metadata was merged with current year indexing protocols. This meant that when the winter briefing pack was generated on December 4th, the system identified the dossier as active contextual material and inserted it into the Section 4 summary.
An error built upon an error built upon an error.
By the time King Charles was informed, the explanation was prepared, but no one dared soften it. The truth was too stark, too fragile. The monarchy, an institution founded on precision and continuity, had stumbled over its own
procedural framework.
In the King's study, the senior archivist stood with both hands clasped tightly behind his back, as though trying to prevent the gravity of the moment from slipping through his fingers. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "the records were never meant to remain. They should have been disposed of during the Sussex transition, but the protocols at the time were unclear.
Some departments acted sooner than others. It created gaps." Charles listened in heavy silence.
His expression did not change, but those present could see fatigue tightening around his eyes. He had spent the past year navigating scandal, restructuring, and internal fractures. To now confront a lapse involving his grandson, one that could be perceived as carelessness or intrusion, was almost too much to absorb. "How sensitive is the material?" Charles asked.
The archivist hesitated.
"Minimal,
sir. Notes only."
"But the implication—" "Yes," the king interrupted, briefly closing his eyes. The implication was catastrophic, because the issue was no longer simply what the file contained, but that it existed at all. In California, Harry had spent years constructing a life defined by boundaries, clear, hard-won, fiercely protected. Every interview, every legal filing, every decision since stepping back had been driven by one guiding principle: protecting his family from the institution that raised him. And now the palace had to confront a truth that would wound him more deeply than any headline. The monarchy still retained traces of his son, not out of malice, but through bureaucratic neglect, and in a family where wounds already ran deep, neglect had cut just as sharply as intent. By midday, the palace had drafted its internal response. But no message, no apology, no procedural explanation could erase the fact that a document containing Archie's name had circulated to 10 individuals within the Crown's administrative body.
10 people were too many.
And somewhere thousands of miles away, a father was about to discover that the institution he walked away from had never fully walked away from his child's silence, once broken, is a delicate thing. It fractures with ease. And on that December morning, it collapsed faster than anyone anticipated. It began with a single communication, an internal alert transmitted from the sovereign's household office to a senior aide at Kensington Palace. A message that should have remained encrypted and unseen. But the aide, hurrying between meetings, forwarded the alert to a secondary inbox overseen by a junior staff member. A minor misjudgment, a fleeting moment of human error. By the time the message reached the secondary inbox, the attached excerpt, a redacted header referencing Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor educational notes, was no longer protected by the palace's secure firewall. For 20 minutes, it sat exposed. And during those 20 minutes, it was viewed not by the press, not by an external intruder, but by an internal contractor with connections to a media researcher.
And that was all it required.
Shortly after 2 o'clock that afternoon, a journalist at a mid-tier British outlet, one known for detecting palace tension with near uncanny precision, received a tip. Not a document, not a file, merely the suggestion of a headline. Internal palace briefing contains sensitive references to Archer's schooling. No specifics, no context, just enough to provoke interest. By 4 o'clock, newsroom phones were vibrating. Editors debated phrasing. Legal teams urged restraint, but the opportunity proved irresistible. Royal stories in December always carried momentum, but anything involving Harry, Meghan, or their children sent engagement soaring within minutes. At 5:30, the first online headline appeared, cautiously worded and wrapped in speculative language. Senior palace document reportedly mentions Archer's education.
Buckingham Palace declines comment.
It was vague, technical, easily dismissed, and for that very reason, it spread rapidly. Within 10 minutes, 2 major British tabloid sites amplified it, each sharpening the tone. The story shifted from a whisper to a simmering controversy. Commentators began posing pointed questions. Why would the palace retain such information? Had privacy protocols been breached? Was Archer's data still stored within royal systems? By 6:15, American networks took notice. It was Columbia Broadcasting System that first interrupted an evening segment with a breaking news ticker. Channel News Network followed by inviting a royal analyst to comment live on air. Within an hour, the story surged across social media, propelled by viewers who had watched Harry grow from boyhood into troubled adulthood, who remember the grief of 1997, who still carried sympathies shaped by Diana's prolonged and painful struggle with the palace. Older American audiences, particularly those over 50, reacted with notable intensity. To them, the notion of royal record-keeping touching a child now living outside the institution felt like history repeating itself. The past reaching into the present, the very thing Harry had fought to escape. By 8 o'clock in New York, the narrative had transformed entirely.
It was no longer about a misfiled document. It was about a perceived breach of trust.
Channel News Network senior correspondent delivered the line that would echo throughout the night.
This isn't an error.
It's a symbol, one that explains why Prince Harry left. In London, palace staff felt the pressure closing in.
Phones illuminated constantly.
Screens refreshed endlessly. Press officers drafted, redrafted, and discarded statements that no longer felt sufficient. Inside the palace communications room, William's team moved decisively.
They understood how narratives solidified.
Once the American conversation set the framework, Britain would follow. And once Britain followed, the monarchy would confront a crisis far greater than an administrative oversight. By 9:30, commentators in the United Kingdom were openly debating whether the palace had knowingly retained information relating to Harry's children. Some spoke cautiously, others with indignation. But the message was clear. The monarchy appeared careless, outdated, and alarmingly disconnected. Across the Atlantic, Meghan's name began trending in the United States, followed by Harry's, then Archer's. Even late-night hosts joined in, one remarking with subdued disbelief, "How does a palace misplace a file about a child who doesn't even live there?" By 10 o'clock London time, the story reached the one place the palace feared most, California. A single headline flashed across Harry and Meghan's phones just 20 minutes apart. Palace leak may involve Archer's school records. The world had learned the news before the monarchy had time to breathe. Inside Buckingham Palace, the winter night deepened. Lights burned past midnight in offices where aides moved with tense, deliberate quiet. The king had been briefed. William had been informed.
And had been alerted.
The legal office was already drafting emergency language. But across the ocean, in a quiet Montecito home, a father stared at a glowing screen with an expression the world had not seen in years. An expression that signaled he would not remain where he was. Because the moment Archer's name entered the palace again, even by mistake, the story ceased to be political and became personal, and Harry was preparing to act, the call that drew Harry back to Britain. The message reached Harry shortly before dawn in Montecito, at a time when the house remained wrapped in that muted, pre-morning stillness. The ocean beyond was a dark, restless blur.
and the Californian air carried a chill that felt unexpectedly out of season.
Harry had been awake for hours, an old habit from years of military service, revived now by the constant pull of unresolved tension. He had seen the headlines the night before, but he had gone to bed hoping the storm might shrink by morning.
It had not.
His phone vibrated twice, a number he recognized immediately.
London, a private line.
A palace code used only when something was deeply and undeniably wrong.
He answered before the second ring ended.
There was no ceremony in the voice that greeted him, no protective layer of protocol, just a senior aide speaking softly, cautiously, as though each word risked triggering something fragile. There has been an internal briefing error. You may already be aware, but His Majesty felt you should hear the details directly before the media cycle intensifies. Harry did not reply at once. He felt the familiar tightening spread through his chest, the kind he had not experienced since the days when his life was divided between obligation and resentment. He stepped into the hallway, away from the bedroom where Meghan still slept, away from the low hum of heaters warming the house.
"Tell me," he said.
The aide inhaled. A transitional file from early 2020 resurfaced during winter indexing. It included notes related to Archie's early educational planning. It was never intended to remain in the system.
It should have been destroyed. Harry closed his eyes.
Of all the explanations he had anticipated, this was somehow worse. So the palace never let go, he said quietly.
Even after I walked away.
It was an error, the aide replied, his voice tightening, a procedural oversight, not intentional retention. But because it appeared in an internal summary, it circulated across several departments.
How many? 10. 10 was too many.
10 potential fractures in a structure that had once claimed every detail of his life without question. What else was in the file? He asked. Minimal content, but the implication is already being distorted online. United States media is framing it as a deliberate violation.
And what does the palace intend to do about it?
A pause followed, the sort that revealed more truth than the answer itself. We are preparing a clarification, but His Majesty believes this conversation cannot wait.
He wishes to see you privately.
That was when Harry felt the ground shift beneath him.
Not with anger, not with panic,
but with something quieter and deeper, an instinct he had suppressed for years.
Does William know? He asked. Yes, sir. The Prince of Wales was informed last night. Of course he was.
The palace hierarchy had not changed, even if Harry had left it. When Harry ended the call, he stood in the dim hallway for a long moment, listening as silence settled around him. Then he walked into the kitchen, where the first trace of daylight was sliding across the floor. Meghan appeared moments later, wrapped in a robe, understanding everything without asking.
"It's real?" she whispered. Harry nodded. "It's worse than the headlines. And my father wants to meet."
Meghan looked away, her expression caught between fear and fury. "They touched Archer's information, Harry."
"Even by accident. That's the line you said they could never cross." He exhaled slowly. "I know."
"And you're going back," she said softly, not as a question, but as fact.
"Yes," he replied.
"I have to."
Because this was no longer about the monarchy.
It was no longer about duty, titles, or tabloid cycles. It was about a child whose name had been spoken in a room he should never again be connected to. By midday, arrangements were underway, discreet and unpublicized. A single seat booked through diplomatic channels, no entourage, no press, just a father returning to confront an institution that had failed him once and had now come dangerously close to failing his son. And by nightfall, Prince Harry was aboard a flight bound for Britain, carrying with him a storm the palace was unprepared to face, the palace divide, William, Catherine, and the winter reckoning. By the time Harry's aircraft crossed into United Kingdom airspace, the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace had shifted from quiet unease to a brittle, frozen vigilance. Dawn had not yet broken, and the estate lay beneath a thin layer of frost, the kind that muffled sound and made every footstep feel heavier. Inside, however, the tension was unmistakable.
William had been briefed hours earlier.
He stood in his private study, early winter darkness pressing against the tall windows. A single lamp cast a muted glow over freshly printed reports, digital sentiment analyses, risk projections, and the internal summary that had triggered the entire storm. Archer's name, printed once, referenced twice, enough to ignite an international firestorm. William placed the papers down and pinched the bridge of his nose, as though the simple motion might lessen the scale of what was unfolding.
He knew Harry would come.
He knew the breach, accidental or otherwise, had crossed a boundary that should never have been touched.
But what unsettled him most was not Harry's anger. It was Harry's urgency.
The kind that meant his brother was not arriving for explanations. He was arriving for the truth. Catherine entered without announcement, a habit she reserved for moments when ceremony felt unnecessary. She wore a thick winter cardigan, her hair loosely pulled back, her expression composed yet weighted with something quieter. "Is it confirmed?" she asked.
William nodded. "He's already in the air."
Catherine released a slow breath, the light catching it as though even the air felt heavy that morning. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the papers on the desk. "This should never have resurfaced," she said. "The timing alone. It feels cruel."
William agreed. He stared again at the document.
The careless indexing mistake that had reignited a narrative they had spent years trying to bury. He knew how fiercely Harry protected Archie, how deeply he distrusted institutional systems, and how swiftly a single error could fracture whatever fragile bridge still existed between them. "Does the king know his arriving today?" Catherine